Brain research has reached a new frontier with potential implications for patients with neurologic and psychiatric disorders and members of the general public. But conducting research on the brain and appropriately implementing interventions or insights derived from it raise ethical challenges. I'm Stephen Morrissey, managing editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'm talking with Christine Grady, chief of the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center. Dr. Grady has co-authored a perspective article about conducting innovative research on brain diseases as part of the journal series on the fundamentals of medical ethics. Dr. Grady, how has technology changed in recent years to make new kinds of brain research possible?
So technology, including but not limited to neural technology, is actually exploding. There have been so many scientific accomplishments and findings that have allowed understanding the cellular structure of the brain, the networks of the brain, recording the brain, being able perhaps to modulate the brain. So lots of important kinds of findings neuroscientifically that have allowed better understanding of the brain and hopefully will lead to better interventions to both prevent and treat neurological and psychiatric diseases.
So in your perspective article, you described 3 hypothetical cases based on existing research, and I want to ask you about them one after the other. The first relates to post-trial care of a patient who receives a brain implant. So what types of brain implants are currently being studied, and what are their potential uses?
So there are many brain implants that are being studied. Probably the most common are deep brain stimulators, but there are a number of brain-computer interfaces and other kinds of sort of prosthetic devices that are using neurological brain technology or other, central nervous system access. And it's a wonderful development because many of the people who are participating in these studies are people who have tried all the available therapies for the condition that they have without much success. And in some cases, DBS or deep brain stimulation is one example. There have been some remarkable successes in terms of people with Parkinson's disease, but also with essential tremor. And there's a number of studies that are currently being done with recalcitrant depression, with substance use disorder, with obesity, with bipolar disease, a number of different diseases and conditions for which deep brain stimulation might be effective and might help those individuals.
So what are the ethical issues surrounding post-trial care? For example, who should be responsible for protecting and supporting patients after studies end?
It's a really wonderful question. It's gotten more attention in recent years than it ever did before. In fact, when you look at the sort of guidelines and ethical literature on research, how to do ethical research, only until 15 years ago was the topic of what happens at the end of a trial even really entertained. And it began, and I'm sort of leading into the implant question in a second, because it really began, at least to my knowledge, I got involved in it when we were talking about what happens with antiretroviral trials for people with HIV disease when they live in countries around the world that didn't have systems in place for being able to provide the antiretroviral therapy. And as you, I'm sure, know, in HIV disease, for example, antiretroviral therapy has been a life changer. People have lived almost normal lifespans if they're on effective therapy. So to put them in a trial and then stop the medication when the trial was over just made absolutely no sense at all. And so people started talking about this and realized that we didn't have good mechanisms or understandings of who was responsible for making sure that somebody who was benefiting from something in a trial was able to get it at the end of the trial. Fast forward now to discussions that we've had now in the last few years about implants. Now, certainly brain implants are not the first kind of implant that's ever existed either. So this issue has been around, but brain implants have a very special kind of place in people's lives. First of all, it's their brain, and the brain has special meaning to people. Secondly, in some of the studies, the brain implants have made a huge difference in the lives of people who have not successfully responded to other kinds of therapies prior to getting an implant. Third, a brain implant, if it's not maintained and not treated for complications, et cetera, has to be explanted. And explanting has risks of its own. It's again another surgery, and taking out a device that's implanted in the brain is not without pretty significant risks. So there's lots of reasons that people who are benefiting from brain implants want to keep them. The problem has been, and you alluded to it a minute ago, who is responsible for making sure that the persons who have these implants can keep them and continue to benefit from them? And much of the discussion that's happened over many years now is that it's a shared responsibility, and there are a number of different entities that should share that responsibility, including the researchers, the funders of research, device manufacturers, the institutions who are hosting the trials or treating the patients, and some responsibility on the participant themselves. And so that's been an ongoing conversation about how to divide up those responsibilities, how to understand what they are, and how to impress upon people that there is a very strong ethical imperative to try to make sure that people who are benefiting from implanted devices can continue to benefit from them.
And then the second case you describe involves a volunteer in a study aiming to reconstruct language from neural activity recorded using fMRI. So what methods have researchers developed to reconstruct continuous language from brain data?
So this is very cutting edge research that has occurred in the last couple of years. Using fMRI and large language models, the researchers that we referred to in this study, although we changed it slightly, were able to take healthy volunteers who were participating in studies, expose them to written language, spoken language, music, and then read what was happening in their brain as they were asked to reconstruct it. So the persons didn't speak their what they heard, but they thought it. And the researchers were able to capture that. And it was quite impressively accurate, or accurate enough that you knew that they were, reconstructing the language that they were listening to or reading. So that's a really interesting finding, and one that could have great potential for early intervention for people that have language problems. It also raises a lot of fascinating and challenging issues about, who gets to control what we can read in people's brains. And certainly in these studies, there was very rigorous informed consent. People knew what was happening, but the idea that one could find out more about a person's thought patterns than what the object of the study was is very, raises a lot of really interesting issues for the future. And as I'm sure many people know, this is a study, and these kinds of studies are being done, and they're finding new ways to improve the processes for these studies, including perhaps developing training modules that don't require direct interaction with individuals, so that you could use perhaps stored data and other kinds of available data that maybe the person from whom the data is coming isn't even aware of. So, I mean, there are interesting challenges ahead. In addition, the more we are able to refine these kinds of methods for understanding what's going on inside somebody's brain, the more likely they are to be commercialized and used for a number of other purposes, many of which people will agree to. But, sort of understanding the range of possibilities, the risk of misuse, the risk of discrimination, the risk of violations of people's confidentiality, all of that is really important and yet to be done for this kind of research.
And then the third case that you discuss relates to the creation of 3D models of human brain tissue. So what kinds of research could brain organoids be used for, and what ethical issues do you see there?
So the development of brain organoids and assembloids is a really promising avenue for being able to do research to understand things that are happening in the brain, in the functional brain, in a way that has never been able to be done before. Because as probably is fairly self-evident, you can't study a person's brain while they're alive by opening it up and looking at it or taking tissue out of it. So brain organoids allow for studying brains in ways that don't require human involvement, other than the donation of their skin cells to make induced pluripotent stem cells from which the brain organoids are constructed. So the possibilities, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I mean, there are some people who could tell you more details about this, but the possibilities that I've heard from the neuroscientists that are studying brain organoids and assembloids are pretty endless. They can learn a lot about how brains are developed, how brains function. They can test things in the laboratory in brain organoids to be able to see, precursors to therapies and things like that. So it's a very exciting avenue of research that neuroscientists are, many are doing and many are excited about. The ethical questions are probably more than I'm going to say, but a couple of them that come to mind. One that has been discussed by several people is these are organoids that are developed in ways that are similar to human brains, and they're developed from induced pluripotent stem cells that come from humans. So the question has been asked, how will we know if the organoids themselves or the assembloids, especially as they become more sophisticated, have some sentience or some memory or some consciousness of some sort? And, I think many scientists believe that that's not possible now, but that, as things get more sophisticated, it could be possible. And part of the challenge is, how will we know? What mechanisms do we have to measure sentience or consciousness in structures like organoids? A second and important part of thinking about organoid research is the people from whom the cells come that become induced pluripotent stem cells and then are used to develop brain organoids. Do we have to have a better system of informed consent from those people? I think my understanding is the consent processes for getting skin cells that are ultimately made into induced pluripotent stem cells are fairly broad, in the sense that at the time of the donation or the collection of cells, sometimes not even known that they'll be used to make induced pluripotent stem cells. But even if it is known that, how the induced pluripotent stem cells will be used is not fully known at the time of the collection of the specimen. So do we need to do better? Do people care about how their cells are being used in future research? And there are some data to suggest that they in fact do. A third interesting issue about organoid research is, since this is laboratory research, not human research, the oversight processes are vague. I'd say vague at best. And so, especially because of this possibility that, there could be some sentience or something developing in the very sophisticated organoids, there probably should be some oversight processes put into place so that somebody's paying attention to when a line might be crossed, when there is a reason to start thinking about, organoids as something more than a collection of cells. And we don't have good oversight mechanisms in place right now for that kind of research.
So finally, and given all that you've said, who should be responsible for establishing ethical parameters for innovative research involving the brain, or for the commercial use of products that come from it?
That's a great question. And I don't think we have a clear, and I can't, in other words, I can't point to it should be X that's going to develop the guidelines for this kind of research. One of the things we called for in our article is, we do have oversight of human research. We have oversight of other kinds of research. We have entities like the Next Track program that tries to think about, broader perspectives, not just the particular studies that are being done. But there is no clear entity that has the responsibility of saying, okay, how do we think about this kind of research that's being done from a big picture perspective in terms of, what are the priorities for doing research, but what are the ethical challenges along the way? And how do we put up appropriate evidence-based guardrails for the kinds of research that is being done and the use of the research findings ultimately post-research? How do we understand how they can be used and misused and try to reduce the possibility of misuse? So I think, people have called for this kind of advisory board before, but I think this is a great example of the kind of research that an advisory board that's looking at the big picture issues might be able to help us navigate. And so that's one possible suggestion for how we should go in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Grady.